These are the sample letters that I'm working with for this project, just to show you guys the setup of it. And I have a sample for us in the discussion board this week of that activity that we're doing using these 3 letters. So these 3 letters are between 2 brothers, James and Alexander Campbell. So the first one we have from James, and it is about meeting face to face with his brother Alexander on the battlefield during the Civil War. James was fighting for the Confederacy, and Alexander was fighting for the Union. The second one is Alexander Campbell wrote to his wife, and he wrote to his wife about that event and his sort of experience of it, and just the stress of the war and knowing that he came so close to firing shots at his brother. And the last one, again, is between him and his wife, reflecting on that experience and the letter that he gets from his brother, and discussing the idea of like a truce happening between the two. But their tone is interesting. It goes back and forth between being like loving brothers and being dedicated and devoted to their cause. So it's an interesting like pull back and forth where there's like sympathy for the other one being shown and then like no tolerance at all. And that's what stood out to me and what I found very interesting, because they, outside of the war, based on the letters, they got along just fine, right? But once the war started, their relationship changed. So for this week, like moving forward, the pieces that like I found interesting about this letter that are leading towards my inquiry is that idea of what like sort of happened between family relationships connected to the Civil War, what it was that the average person was fighting for that was maybe not the same as the like politicians or wealthy people, right? So if we think about sort of the plantation myth that we get, right, the Gone with the Wind, all of that stuff, is that slaveholders owned like a dozen slaves, and there was a plantation, and there were slave quarters, and there was all this land to be worked. But that was like, when we talk about like the 1% today, only like 1 to 3% of slave owners owned a significant number of slaves. The majority of slave owners owned less than 5, right? So, and you'd have like the, those who had like one enslaved person, and they had like a tiny little cabin, and that person like slept in the same room with them. And right, that idea of like this big plantation South that was being fought for was only a tiny, 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 tiny portion. And so my question is like, what about everyone else who wasn't in that situation? What was their impetus for fighting in the war? So when I get to like organizing our information for our assignment this week, right, I have a little setup here introducing our brothers. Then what I have bolded here and noted, this would be like a traditional like informative thesis statement, right? The letters between the brothers show this thing. Then I give a little, the specific places in the letter moving forward from this, right? So the quote from James where he says, if such, meaning on the battlefield again, should be the case, you have but to discharge your duty to your cause, for I can assure you I will strive to dispense of my duty to my country and cause. That means if we see each other again, you better fire, because I'm going to fire at you. And then from Alexander, right, at one point he tells his wife, I hope to God that he and I will get safe through it all, and he will have his story to tell about his side, and I'll have my story to tell about my side. So Alexander is imagining old age at the end of the war, sitting around, right, like on their porch or whatever, and just like telling stories about the war. So it's definitely an interesting experience, because he's like, I hope we both make it through, and then we can like, I don't know if I would say like laugh about this in the future, but right, like move forward and not have this as an issue. And so that led me to, right, what I was talking about. So despite fighting on opposing sides during the war, the brothers maintained a friendly relationship in their letters. After suggesting they would have to shoot one another if they met again, James goes on to send his love to Sister Anne, who lives in the north. Likewise, Alexander passes James' message along through his wife, Jane. These letters both talk about their duty to the country without a commitment to the war's actual cause, which makes me wonder, what were the sentiments about the Civil War from those outside the political arena? How committed were both Southerners and Northerners to the actual cause versus just their respective home regions? So last week we looked at those songs, Northmen Come Out and like the Southern Confederate song. And as you guys noticed, there were like a lot of similarities, right? They were both like fighting for a just cause. The Northmen's Come Out, it was published in Vanity Fair, and it was a recruitment song. The Confederacy one also was recruitment, but it was also a morale boosting, but both of them were right at the start of the war. At the beginning of the war, it was believed it would be over in 1 month, right? Not 4 years. So the soldiers were not signing up for 4 years of fighting initially. And there's some letters where you can see like just the mental deterioration because they get tired of not being at home and they don't necessarily know what they're fighting for other than like fighting for liberty, fighting for country, but very abstract ideals. And so that's sort of what makes me ask these questions, right? Like, what is it that was like driving the average soldier, that's different than like the big political cause, which is why the war started, right? It started in the Senate, the U.S. Senate, with the states seceding from the Union and creating the Confederacy and all of that stuff, right? That was all the political arena. And there were huge pockets of people in the South, right? Like West Virginia exists because it didn't want to secede with Virginia. That is how like West Virginia was created. East Tennessee, they didn't want to secede with Tennessee, but they were like trapped with like southern states all around them. So they couldn't be like West Virginia because they were like in the middle of the South, right? So it's not like it was an entire, unified decision for succession either. There was a lot of opposition to it. East Tennessee in particular, there was not much slave ownership in that area. So they sort of weren't interested in fighting to, keep slavery. So again, this is just thinking about, we want to organize our thoughts before we move over. So now I have like clear questions that I can move into my secondary sources, trying to find the answers and see what information there is that is representing different groups of people and their experiences of the war.